Welcome to another session of the 68th Annual Utah State Historical Society Conference on the theme Rights and Responsibilities. All conference programming is being held virtually this year, and a full listing of our keynote, plenary, and other session information is available on our website at ushs.utah.gov. I'm Jedediah Rogers. I'm one of the co-editors of the Utah Historical Quarterly. And today's session is super important and timely. We're talking about slavery and race in early Utah territory. I have with me two distinguished scholars, and I'll introduce both of them and let them each go in the order that they're introduced. Paul Reeve, his talk today is titled Understanding Utah Territory's 1852, an Act in Relation to Service. And Paul is the Simons Professor of Mormon Studies in the History Department at the University of Utah, where he teaches on courses on Utah history, Mormon history, and the history of the U.S. West. His book, Religion of a Different Color, Race and the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness, was published by Oxford University Press in 2015 and has received Best Book awards from Utah State Historical Society, the Mormon History Association, and the John Whitmer Historical Association. Relevant to this conversation, he's project manager and general editor of a digital database, Century of Black Mormons, designed to name and identify all known Black Mormons baptized into the faith between 1830 and 1930. And the database is live at centuryofblackmormons.org. And then our second presenter is Melvin C. Johnson, and his presentation is entitled John Burton of Parowan, Utah, 1797 to 1865, One Slave's Life and Times in Pioneer Dixie. And Mel is an independent historian and retired college professor, and he's author of the award-winning Polygamy on the Paternalism, Lyman White's Mormon Village in Antebellum, Texas, published by Utah State University Press in 2006, and also author of The Life and Times of John Pierce Hawley, a Mormon Ulysses of the American West, published by Greg Koford Books in 2019, and he's author of many other articles. He now lives, I understand, he's transitioned to St. George, Utah. So with that, I will turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Jed. It's my pleasure to be with you. My presentation is, I think, designed to set the big picture context for what Mel will tell us about John Burton. So we have a big picture kind of presentation and then a more specific one. So I just wanted to walk us through the act in relation to service that the Utah Territorial Legislature passed in 1852. And I'll just frame my comments around three central questions. What type of law did the legislature pass? What did it stipulate? And what choices did legislators have? So the first question, an act in relation to service passed in 1852, I think perhaps people prior to this have argued that Utah passed a slave code, and in fact, it does legalize slavery in Utah Territory. But the argument that myself and my co-authors are making in our upcoming publication on the 1852 legislative session is in fact that the act in relation to service was a conservative form of gradual emancipation. And this particular paragraph that I've highlighted here is really the significant evidence that we've uncovered. The document that you see is the actual first version of the bill. And we found that original version, and you'll see an important section of that original bill crossed out. And so that's what leads us to conclude that this is a form of gradual emancipation. So as originally drafted, the bill said the master or mistress or his, her, or their heirs shall be entitled to the services of the said servant or servants. So what this is talking about is the white enslavers and the black enslaved. The master or white mistress are entitled to the services of the said black servant or servants and his, her, or their children until the curse of servitude is taken from the descendants of Canaan, unless forfeited as hereinafter provided. So that important clause that is highlighted there in black, or emphasized there in black, is the clause that is actually crossed out before the bill is passed. So if you read that section with that important clause removed, really what that tells us is the legislature's intent was that the condition of servitude does not pass on to the next generation. So that makes this a conservative form of gradual emancipation. What I mean by that is conservative because it frees no one then a slave. Everyone who is brought to Utah territory as a slave will die a slave. But the next generation will not inherit the condition of servitude that their parents had. That makes it a form of gradual emancipation. And we've compared what Utah passes, for example, with Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, New York. All of those states passed forms of gradual emancipation. And of the legislators in the Utah Territorial Legislature who were from the North, full 50% of them came from states that had passed gradual emancipation laws. So Pennsylvania's law, for example, freed no one then a slave when the law passed. Everyone who was enslaved at the moment that the law passed would die as a slave. But the next generation would be considered servants, just like Utah's bill stipulates. They would be considered servants until age 28, and then at age 28 they would be free. Utah's law doesn't have a clause making them wait until age 28. It simply doesn't pass on the condition of servitude to the next generation. So that makes it a form of gradual emancipation. Gradual because it has to play out over a long period of time. Now, in Utah's case, we don't have to wait for any of that to happen simply because it's only in force for 10 years. Congress, the United States Congress, outlaws slavery in all territories in 1862. That's not the Emancipation Proclamation. That will come later. This is simply a bill passed by the Republicans in Congress in 1862, where they say Congress has control of the territories, therefore we can outlaw slavery in the territories. And they do that in 1862. So Utah's law would have been in force for 10 years. And the Deseret News publishes news that Congress has outlawed slavery in the territories. So it was known in Utah territory. So a form of gradual emancipation is the first thing. What did it stipulate? I just pulled out some of the highlights from the bill for us to think about and walk through. It really is distinct from the type of chattel slavery laws that were being passed in the South. The majority of the provisions in Utah's territorial code are aimed at regulating white enslavers, not the black enslaved. So one of the major concerns, and there are theological reasons for the Latter-day Saints who are also very much a part of this process. The entire legislative body is comprised of Latter-day Saints. And so, they're passing a law for Utah territory, but there are also theological implications. And there is considerable concern by Brigham Young, who is the leader of his religion, but also Utah's territorial governor, concern over race mixing. So one of the provisions of the bill that passes stipulates that white enslavers cannot have sex with their black enslaved. If they do, the penalty is that they would forfeit their enslaved, or their enslaved people would become free. The bill also just outlaws any sex between any white people and any black people. This is not intermarriage, it's just, it's sex. And the penalty would be a fine of $1,000 and imprisonment up to 3 years. So considerable concern over race mixing is animating those who are passing this piece of legislation. The other provisions are really concerned with regulating the enslavers. Enslavers were required to provide comfortable habitations, clothing, bedding, sufficient food, and recreation, and not be guilty of cruelty or abuse or neglect to feed, clothe, or shelter his servants in a proper manner. So attempting to regulate the conditions that the enslaved would have to endure. Enslavers also cannot take their enslaved out of Utah Territory without the permission of the enslaved. And the bill stipulated that the enslaved would have to have a private interview with a probate judge. Private meaning that the enslaver could not be present, so that the enslaved could, of their own free will, at least in theory, stipulate that they did not want to be taken out of Utah Territory. The penalty for taking an enslaved out of Utah Territory against their will was $5,000 and up to 5 years imprisonment, and they would forfeit the enslaved. And enslavers were required to send their servant or servant to school not less than 18 months between the ages of 6 years and 20 years. So 18 months of education is required of the enslavers. That's also something that we should understand is distinct from slave codes passed in the American South, chattel slave codes passed in the American South, many of which stipulated that if you were an enslaver, you could not educate your slaves. In fact, it criminalized the education of slaves. It prevented slaves from being educated in the South. Utah's law requires slaves to be educated. So there are some distinctions then in the bill that passes. A form of gradual emancipation, and the bill is aimed at regulating the enslavers, not the black enslaved. So what choices did legislators have? And I think the best answer to that question comes from federal judge Zerubbabel Snow in 1852. He is presiding over a case that actually overlaps with this legislative session. It's the trial of Don Pedro Leon, who is he is a slave trader coming up from New Mexico into Utah Territory. He's arrested and put on trial for engaging in the slave trade of Indian children without a license from Utah Territory. He had one from New Mexico Territory, but not from Utah Territory. And in the process of deciding this case, Zerubbabel Snow basically stipulates Utah has no law legalizing slavery, either Native American enslavement or African American enslavement. And he tells the legislature basically the act which created Utah Territory included a clause giving to the people here the right to introduce slavery or reject it. In other words, they had a choice. They could have rejected slavery, but the legislature in 1852 chose white supremacy and to perpetuate enslavement, although remember, it's a form of gradual emancipation. So it's really in response to Zerubbabel Snow's decision in the Pedro Leon case that you have these two laws that are passed in 1852. There's an Indian indenture bill that passes in 1852, and then an act in relation to service, because the judge says you have no laws here that proactively allow slavery, and unless you have a positive law allowing it, then people are free. And so the legislature responds by passing an Indian indenture bill and an act in relation to service. It's important to know that all the legislators did not go along with the passage of this bill. We have a really important speech given by Orson Pratt, who was a member of the territorial legislature and also a sitting LDS apostle. So once again, those overlap between ecclesiastical positions as well as political positions taking place in this legislative session. And Orson Pratt wants the bill rejected outright. He doesn't want, he actually makes a motion that the bill be rejected outright and gives a speech on the 27th of January very strongly opposing the bill. Shall we introduce this evil in our midst? No, I hope there is wisdom, light, and intelligence enough within the bosom of this honorable council to spurn the idea with indignation, Orson Pratt says. When in our situation we are legislating in the capacity of people who desire to serve God, in the capacity to be the most benefit to the nations abroad, is it not known to this honorable council the light in which slavery is looked upon by almost every enlightened nation or heathen? They look upon it with disgust. And I think, Pratt here is referring to the fact that the British Empire has outlawed slavery. Now, remember, they do so by compensating the enslavers, not the enslaved. They pay the enslavers to free their slaves, and it's a gradual process. But nonetheless, he's saying, look, slavery's on its way out across the globe. Why in the world would we introduce it here in Utah Territory? He finds the idea preposterous. Wherein can it be expedient for us to suffer slavery to come into this territory when we can avoid it? It would not be a sin to keep it out. Shall we hedge up the way before us by introducing this abominable slavery? And he says it's enough to cause the angels in heaven to blush. So what we know then is that Orson Pratt is in a debate with Brigham Young over this servant bill, but Orson Pratt also in that legislative session is advocating for black male voting rights. He's advocating that black men should be given the right to vote in Utah Territory in 1852. Brigham Young speaks out stridently against this, and we have then the servant bill that gets passed, as well as Brigham Young first openly articulating a racial priesthood restriction within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he also is responding to Orson Pratt's contention about black male voting rights. So Brigham Young then will say, in response to the proposition that black men should be allowed to vote, we just as well make a bill here for mules to vote as Negroes or Indians. You cannot find within men upon the earth who are of the seed of Cain any that possess knowledge and sensibility enough to vote. And seed of Cain is his way of understanding who black people are. He suggests there's this curse of Cain that traces to the Bible as a result of Cain killing his brother Abel, and he understands black people to be descendants of Cain. It's a part of the broader Judeo-Christian tradition that predates Mormonism by a couple of hundred years. Nonetheless, he brings that understanding with him into his position as an LDS leader and gives it theological weight. He also says what we're trying to do today is to make the Negro equal with us in all our privileges, once again pushing back against Pratt and Pratt's suggestion that black men be allowed to vote. My boys shall be against it all the day long. And in the very same speech then, he also then introduces this notion of black priesthood denial. If there never was a prophet or apostle of Jesus Christ spoke it before, I tell you this, people that are commonly called Negroes are the children of Cain. I know they are. I know they cannot bear rule in the priesthood in the first sense of the word. So Brigham Young stridently speaking out against black voting rights, speaking in favor of the servant code that passes that legislative session, and he will sign it into law. And also then openly articulating a racial priesthood restriction. Just want to close by just giving one example of how this plays out in the life of one person. An enslaved man named Tom is brought to Utah Territory that very fall. So this bill passes in February of 1852. That fall, Hayden Wells Church who is an enslaver from the South, brings his black enslaved man named Tom with him to Utah Territory. So this law that just passed would then govern the relationship of Tom and Hayden Wells Church, and later Abraham Smoot. In 1854, 2 years later, Tom is baptized in the LDS Sugar House Ward into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Then at some point, Hayden Wells Church transfers Tom to Abraham Smoot. Abraham Smoot, this is the 1860 slave schedule for Utah Territory. You'll see black people are not listed, black enslaved people, I should say, freed blacks are, black enslaved people are not listed in any federal census until 1870. They're only counted as a hash mark, and this is Utah's slave schedule for 1860. You see Abraham Smoot claims 2 men age 40 as his enslaved. And Abraham Smoot, then one of those enslaved men is Tom, who he gets from Hayden Wells Church. Abraham Smoot is Tom's LDS bishop at the time. And then 2 years later, Tom passes away, and this is the death record. It simply says, Tom, a Negro, belonged to Bishop Smoot. And he passes away about 2 months before the United States Congress passes its law outlawing slavery in all U.S. territories, including Utah Territory. So I'm just sharing that with you to stipulate that this bill then that passes in 1852 would have governed Tom's entire life until he passes away in 1862, 2 months before Congress would have made him a free man. He was relying upon Republicans in Congress, not his fellow Latter-day Saints and his enslaver, his bishop, to free him. But in fact, radical Republicans in Congress, had he lived long enough, would have been the ones who would have freed him. So that gives us a sense of the fact that for Tom, the bill, even though it's gradual emancipation, wouldn't have emancipated him had he had children. His children would have been born free in Utah Territory, but Tom died enslaved in Utah Territory. Thank you.
We're going to talk about John Burton, a slave of frontier Parowan, here for the annual Utah State Historical Society. Ken Burns, in his documentary dealing with Jackie Robinson and his integration or reintegration of modern MLB, said that one of his goals was to try to penetrate the tyranny of mythology that surrounded Jackie Robinson, that embedded him as if it were, in a poor metaphor or simile, as a fly in amber, that he was trying to punch through that mythology to see the real man. I would like to suggest that we have the same issues when we're trying to look at Black Utah individuals and Utah Black Mormons in the period of Utah Territory. We are trapped by myth. We are trapped by family history. We are trapped by the perils of presentism. And what Burns wanted to do was an opportunity to help liberate Jackie from the tyranny of the mythology that had grown up around him, and George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and many great figures in our lives end up being, unfortunately, one-dimensional kind of stick figures. And here's a good example of it. We have an African-American plainsman, an almost romantic view of it, though we see the realism of the plains. We like to think of that, or I do, as being John Burton, but it is not John Burton. And I want to try to get away from these romanticized images. So consider the prompt from Ken Burns. Look at the image of the horseman above, and we'll proceed. Black lives today, along with COVID, is changing our America and our world as well. It once again focuses Americans on the attention of the cross we bear of race in American history. A wonderful comment by William Faulkner almost 70 years ago. It leads us to this mythology that confuses discussions of Black lives and Black Mormon slaves in 19th century Utah territory. I want to talk, though, first about what we do know about John Burton before we begin talking about the other issues. First time John Burton appears in our history objectively is in the Annals of the Southern Utah Mission, compiled and edited by James Godson Blake over a 50-year period. It deals with the pioneer listage of the individuals traveling under George A. Smith down to Parowan, December 1850 to January 1851. And there we see highlighted in yellow, colored, a man by the name of John Burton. I first saw this in 2014, and over the years became more and more interested. If you look over to the right, you can see Blake's handwriting. And you notice that he has no age. He's timeless, he's ageless. We know that he's colored, and we know that he is a member of the pioneer group. And then James Blake never talks about him again. What is interesting is that Burton has two patriarchal blessings on record at the Family History Center in Salt Lake City. His name is John Burton, supposedly born 1795 to 1797 in Bland, Virginia. His father is spelled variously as Zachariah or Zechariah. His mother's name is Jenny. John Smith gave a blessing in Salt Lake City. And what is interesting about the blessing is the general lack of paternalism. It gives his name, gives him from the tribe of Canaan, says the day will come when he will hold the priesthood, and that in fact a kingdom has been created for him before the foundation of the earth. Elisha Grove, the patriarch of Parowan, will give him a similar blessing in 1854. Going back to the timeline, this is what we do know beyond the mythology. He's born in 1797. Susan McCord, who is secondary only by a narrow margin to John Burton in his story, is born in 1808. John is bought by her father, James McCord, about 1815, and then begins a 50-year journey for John across the American frontier western borderland. John moves with his enslavers from Virginia to Tennessee and then to Missouri. The family settles in eastern Missouri near the Salt River. They first hear of LDS missionaries in 1831 or 1832, they will witness the joining of the two wings of Zion's camp at the Allred settlement 4 miles away. The McCord family joins the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, by 1835. And when James McCord dies a very lingering death, John Burton sits up with him in the evening, every evening, for several months. John becomes Susan's property, and then when Susan marries to John Newton Burton, that property is vested in her permanently. What is interesting about this is that James McCord and Elizabeth Mary Barnett, Susan's parents, have a total of 5 children. By 1839, when her husband dies, it's only Susan McCord, her 2 children with Burton, and John himself are the only members left in this small group, all of Susan's siblings having previously died. In 1840, we know the McCords and Burton moved to Nauvoo. I think he has been freed by then or shortly thereafter. He may be referred to in unflattering terms, but we never had the term slavery applied to him again after this time. In 1846, Susan marries Bishop Joseph L. Robinson. She becomes his plural wife, his first plural wife, and they move on to winter quarters. In 1847, we begin to witness the increasing independent action by John Burton. Bishop Robinson commissions Burton to journey on to the Great Valley in the later companies of 1847. And there he plants crops for the Burton Robinson family for the next year. In 1848, they come to the valley. In 1848 to 1850, they live in Davis County. And then in 1851 to 1865, they all move as part of the Parowan mission to become the first settlement in Utah's Dixie, in the very northeastern corner of that area. John will live there until he dies in 1865, and Susan will die there in 1872. They are both buried in the Parowan Cemetery. What are our questions then? We know he was born a slave. We know he remained one for decades, but we don't know when he was freed, between 1840 and 1862. We know that he was a lifelong slave and then a servant to the McCord-Burton family. He became a member in the church in 1835, faithful until his death, never held the priesthood. He was alleged to have saved Blythe family members from Missouri vigilantes in 1838 during the Missouri Mormon War. He drove animal teams for labor tithing during the building of the Nauvoo Temple. What is very interesting and pointed out to me is that he interpreted the testimonies given in tongues by white members in the Parowan church for over a decade. You had a man born a black slave in America who is interpreting Thursday night testimonies from the gift of tongues into English. He sits up with the dying. not only James McCord, but also the LDS stake president in Parowan in 1855. He receives the two patriarchal blessings, and then he dies. This is a picture of Susan, and also of Susan in John's grave plots, grave sites at Parowan. John Burton, in his story, is our story. We obviously are going to be discussing race and slavery and Black Mormons for some time to come in Utah and across the nation. We need conversation. We need dialogue. We need a just medium to guard against an excess of belief. We need reconciliation. We don't need name shaming, culture canceling, silencing, or negative forms of bullying. And I am trying to get back to the John Lewis statement, and I will have to read it from my sheet. John Lewis said, part of the effort of the movement was to tame the madness of men, to take the beast that lives in all of us and turn it towards love, to show humankind a different way of compassion, of connection, and community of peace and nonviolence. No, you cannot take an eye for an eye. If you do, we will all be blind. I wonder if John Burton thought of his life as a form of the garden, and that he was cast out from it, as all of us have been, but that he did not let that fact that he was a slave or a servant crush him, that he did the very best he could with what he had, and within his limitations created an amazing life. And we can see some of the outlines behind the mythology of family history. And we need to know more about it. I think Burton's story challenges us all. We don't need to eat of the forbidden fruit of racism. We don't need to listen to the snakes that propose it. I'm looking forward to what the summer and fall brings as we realize that Black lives matter, Black Mormon lives matter, and Black Mormon slave lives matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mel. And thank you, Paul. You're welcome to, I think that what we should do now is have a little conversation between the three of us, or perhaps primarily between the two of you, about your presentations and maybe more generally, the moment in which we're living in right now, the race reckoning that we're experiencing collectively and individually as white and Black and people of color in this nation. And I wanted to ask, perhaps first, Paul, for you, I'm curious because part of this, part of the presentations that both of you gave had an aspect of remembering. So in your presentation, Paul, you talked about Tom, and I understand that the recognizing his death spot was fairly recent. I'm wondering how many of those who in early territorial Utah who were slaves, Black Mormon slaves, how many of them have been recognized in terms of understanding their life through history or through acknowledging their gravestones? what do we know about how have these individuals been recognized?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jed. So in Tom's case, he was buried in the Salt Lake Cemetery with no marker, and it's only this last year that the Salt Lake Cemetery reconciled that. The city itself paid for a headstone for Tom. They had a little ceremony. Several people spoke. Mayor Biskupski talked. Janetta Williams, who's the head of Utah's chapter of the NAACP, spoke. It was a nice ceremony, and there is now a headstone that marks Tom's grave. The question in terms of how many are buried in unmarked graves, I don't know the answer specifically for that. I think really, the fact that Utah, had a servant code in 1852, I don't think, my sense from social media engagement is that most people aren't even aware that there were Black enslaved people in Utah Territory, that we had a servant code that legalized slavery for 10 years in Utah Territory. So I'm not really sure that the public is terribly aware. There are organizations in Utah who are attempting to address this issue. The Utah Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, for example, is very much interested in making sure that all Black pioneers have headstones, and they are tackling that. So one of the 1847 pioneers into the Salt Lake Valley in the Vanguard Company, Harkley Wells, was also buried he was also enslaved, also buried in the Union Fort Cemetery without a marker, and Oggs has recently rectified that, and he now has a very nice marker over his grave right next to Green Flake, who carved the marker that marks the resting place for himself and his wife. But Harkley Wells never did have a marker until just this last year. So I think Oggs is attempting to rectify that and doing what it can to research and make sure that all Black enslaved people, all Black pioneers have markers. I can sort of fill in from the Century of Black Mormons database how many enslaved people were baptized, and we found many more than scholars originally anticipated. I think we're up to about 26 enslaved people who were baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at some point or another. Now, not all of those migrated to Utah Territory. Some of them were baptized, in the American South, and they may have been sold, or their enslavers never migrated. A variety of different circumstances. Some of them did come to Utah Territory, like John Burton. Others did not. But we are in the process of identifying all known Black people baptized into the faith, and when we're also documenting those who were enslaved. Anyone before 1862, 1865, before the Emancipation Proclamation, who was baptized, we document whether they were a freed person or an enslaved person. And so I think we're about 26 enslaved people baptized into the faith before 1865.
And Mel, speaking of being baptized, what do you make of the significance that John Burton received, the patriarchal blessings and the content of those blessings?
Part of the problem of dealing with the issue of Utah Black slaves, Black Mormons, is trying to find out the extent of how their humanity was recognized and received by their white neighbors. John was not necessarily a cherished individual in Parowan more than anybody else. They were all working to make a living, to survive down there. But he pulled his share. And I think that he was recognized as a person of worth before the patriarchal blessings. But when we come to the blessings themselves, we do see them, at least the patriarchs, recognizing him as a man of worth. They recognize that he is a black man. One of them suggests that he makes sure that he gives due diligence to his mistress. But that's the last intimation of color in the blessings. He will receive the priesthood. He will have a kingdom. His day will come. And it's being recognized. He contributes $15 to the building of the Parowan church. He interprets through the gift of tongues, testimonies given in tongues. A black servant doing this for white members in Parowan, Texas. I know of no other testimony or record like that. And James Henry Martineau is not necessarily known as a progressive light of humanity in his record, but he records it. He records it as it happens. And thank heavens he does. And there's a lesson here for all of us to learn. When we deal with the issue today of what happened then in the condition of today, we need to be very careful of the issue of presentism. Green Flake's story and John Burton's story are both mythologized. Flake's biography or biographical writing has been termed romanticized fiction. I don't think it is. I think it is family history glossed through generations that creates this likable, well-respected individual by the family. I don't think that necessarily existed that way. But we have the same thing with John Burton, who is obviously very, very close to the family. And his biography is romanticized in a historical fiction by a granddaughter of Susan McCord. And we deal with the language of blacks, Mark Twain-esque, in the book. We are exposed to his almost childlike, according to Mrs. Riggs, faith in God and in Mormonism, but we're also exposed to his heroism in Missouri and going into the midst of the mob and pulling people out to safety. He's the man who works with Bishop Robinson from Winter Quarters going back to Missouri to bring people in 1846 forward, the poor and the destitute. He does those testimonies. He digs graves for labor tithing. He sets up with the dead. So along with trying to avoid shaming, culture canceling, silencing, and negative forms of bullying, saying, we need to rectify all this today. And John Lewis's statement really rings with me. If we take an eye for an eye, none of us are going to see. But on the other side, we can't put it through a romantic gloss and forget that we're dealing with enslavers and the enslaved at a particular time in our history.
just briefly, and then I'll turn it to the two of you, but it strikes me at 2 points. One, the patriarchal blessings seems to me they offer deferred blessings and deferred promises in the same way that the act in the relation to servitude offers deferred freedom. And I'm curious to know if you had comments on why not the immediacy of rectifying the situation and offering the blessings in the now. That's one. The other comment is to your mythologizing. Mel, I just want to be clear. Are you saying that in terms of mythology, Black individuals have been either lionized for great deeds or they've been characterized as sort of innocent children? Is that kind of what you mean by the mythologies that have grown up around
I do.
histories?
I do. I think we're dealing with paternalistic views on one side and mythology on the other. And it also gives us an insight into particular characteristics in Utah genealogy and family history. As soon as we joined the church, we freed our slaves. Or our slaves did not want to be freed, they wanted to stay with us, which goes right back to Paul Reeve's discussion at times on the paternalism of whites for the childlike nature of Blacks. On the other hand, we need to be careful in lionizing, because for every exemplary John Burton or Green Flake, I'm sure that we can find characters that were not good citizens, and that's wrong, good inhabitants of the community. This is what I mean about mythologizing. We're trying to cut through it. We can glorify James Bowie at the Alamo, which was really a battle against giving up slavery in Texas for the whites, and say what a hero he was. But then we forget that he was a slave runner and a slave trader from Mexico into Louisiana and back. It's trying to get through the pitfalls of presentism. We can be too soft. We can be too harsh. Let me make a real quick comment. I'm in St. George. I'm a Dixie College graduate. As you know, discussion is engaging here on what to do with the names of Dixie. And I'm hearing it from all sides from my comrades. We changed the name of Dixie State University because of its connection with the original settlers and many of their connections with the South. We need to take it all into consideration. Changing a university name is a big deal. However, if we have a plantation drive, I think it should be changed to something else here in St. George. And as a historian, I normally never take a particular stance. But I will on that. We might have a John Burton Drive in Parowan. Why not remember these people? But we try to keep it in perspective. And my perspective is that my perspective may not be in perspective. We need a discussion.
Jed, I can address the question about gradual emancipation versus immediate emancipation. Obviously, Orson Pratt is arguing for immediate emancipation, where that the law should not be passed at all. He actually makes that proposal to the legislature. He doesn't win that argument, but he wants the bill dismissed in its entirety. So that was under debate in the 1852 legislative session. That was an option. Brigham Young just seems to win out. There's one other speech given on the bill, and that is Orson Spencer, and he sort of adopts a middle road. Now, Brigham Young, in terms of, immediate abolition versus chattel slavery, Brigham Young actually is adopting a middle road. In the 21st century, we like to just think in terms of stark black and white, free or unfree. And, servitude is a distinct legal category in the 19th century. So what they're passing is, in fact, a distinct legal category. Brigham Young is striking a middle ground. He speaks out stridently against chattel slavery in the South. He doesn't like it, he says. And he speaks out stridently against the immediate abolitionists in the North. He doesn't like them either. And so really what he's trying to do is strike a middle road. And, it's not satisfactory. It's not terribly satisfying, as a historian looking back, because you have Orson Pratt, who I think was on the right side of history in this whole debate. But Brigham Young is saying we're going to strike this middle ground between the immediate abolitionists who are arguing for immediate emancipation and full black equality. And that is a radical minority even in the North, in the context of the 1850s. That's a radical minority even in the North. The vast majority of Northerners who are against slavery are gradual emancipationists as well as colonizationists. The other part of the problem is a racial problem. So slavery is a twofold problem. It's an unfree problem, but it's also a racial problem. So once you free the slaves, what do you do with them? And white Northerners who may very well be against slavery don't want 4 million freed slaves intermixing amongst them and darkening the white race and making it unfit for democracy. So there are all kinds of proposals, such as the American Colonization Society, which says we should take them to Africa. And so all of that is a part of the cultural milieu within which, this debate is taking place in Utah Territory. And so, Utah comes out with a form of gradual emancipation. It could have outright rejected the bill and emancipated those who were in Utah Territory as slaves. That was an option. Orson Pratt argued for it. He didn't win the day. Brigham Young argues for a moderate position, and I know it doesn't sound like it because these people were still enslaved, but what passes is very distinct from the chattel slavery being enacted in the South, but it's not immediate emancipation being advocated by the radical few in the North. And if you understand the spectrum of religious thinkers in the 19th century, there are those who are moderate on this position, and they're largely forgotten because they're not hot or cold, they're lukewarm. And I think Brigham Young fits right in the middle there. And it's not very satisfying from the 21st century perspective. We want someone to take a firm stance. And what ends up passing is this form of gradual emancipation, which does provide some legal protections to those who are enslaved in Utah Territory. But we also have to understand the bill that passes from the perspective of those who are enslaved. And I'm not sure that anyone in Utah Territory who's enslaved wakes up the day after the bill passes and says, oh, well, thank goodness I am legally defined as a servant and I have some legal protections. I'm not sure that it really changes their life much, to be quite frank about it. I don't know how much they know about the bills that pass, what enforcement mechanisms are in place. We just haven't found any evidence to suggest that anyone is enforcing that they get an education, for example, that they are provided adequate food and clothing, for example. It's in the law, but how is the law actually applied in practice? And the historical record doesn't give us a lot to go on to answer that question.
Jed, Paul, that was great. Jed, on patriarchal blessings, very, very quickly. You say, why not immediate emancipation? But a patriarchal blessing, as I understand it, is conditioned on what? Obedience and following the covenant path, and blessings will be laid upon you as you earn them. I am sure that John Burton understood that concept just as much as any white in Salt Lake City or Parowan.
Mm-hmm.
Got to walk the walk as well as talk the talk to be blessed at the end. Paul, I really liked your comment about, does the law change anything in the lives of Black Mormon slaves other than they can't be taken out of the state without permission?
Yeah, and we will. So Christopher Rich and Lejean Caruth and I, the three of us are working on this documentary history of that 52 legislative session. And there is one case that does play out in the court system. So therefore it enters the historical record. And it does seem to provide some protection to the enslaved person. And he's prevented from being taken out of the territory. And so, it does offer some legal rights. And if you compare that to what a Black enslaved person in the American South under chattel slavery experienced, it really is different. It really is distinct, but it also leaves us really, I'm completely unsatisfied, right? Because you have Pratt who is saying, let's get rid of it altogether. And I think it's really important, Mel, like you said, to take into account, okay, so it's one thing to understand this from the perspective of the white legislators who are passing the bill. We want to understand what they believe they were passing. But we should also take into account what this meant in the lives of those who were enslaved. And none of them were invited to weigh in on the bill. And like I said, I'm not sure that it made that much of a difference in their lives the next morning. They said, somehow my life is so much better because I'm legally defined as a servant rather than called a slave in this bill. Right, and we do have some legal protections. In some, at least one case that we can figure it out, and there were, the bill also requires the enslavers to register the enslaved with probate judges, and we do find 3 registrations. So they were being legally registered, but not a lot of indication that it really makes a significant difference in the lives of those who were enslaved. And that's why I shared Tom's experience, because for him, he was brought into the territory enslaved and he died enslaved 2 months before U.S. Congress, not the territorial legislature, not his own bishop, freed him.
Paul, do we have any sense for how the Southern slave owners would have, like Abraham Smoot, would have felt about passage of the 1852 Act? And then I'm also curious to know if there were any, I think you mentioned maybe other court cases, but I'm wondering how this issue wound its way through the courts and in the legislative halls thereafter.
Yeah, so no record about Smoot. He wasn't in the territory at the time. He arrives that fall. And sometimes there are stories that circulate that somehow Smoot was involved in the legislative session. That's the mythologizing that Mel is talking about. He wasn't involved at all in that legislative session. He wasn't in the territory at the time. I'm trying to think. There is one enslaver who's in the legislative session. I did borrow also from Nate Ricks, who did a master's thesis on the legislative session and the servant code. And he documented where everyone in that legislative session was born. The vast majority are from the North. And of those from the North, like I mentioned, 50% are from states that pass gradual emancipation laws. So they would have grown up in states with gradual emancipation laws. 50% of those from the North grew up in states with gradual emancipation laws. And so they did have that as a model. Unfortunately, we only have 3 people who are recorded by George Watt weighing in on the bill itself. It's Orson Pratt, Orson Spencer, and Brigham Young. the record seems to indicate that other people are speaking, but George Watt doesn't record their perspectives. And so we don't have an enslaver who is in the legislative session who is weighing in on the bill. And so the most direct answer to your question is we simply don't know, because if an enslaver did weigh in, George Watt didn't record it. Frustratingly, didn't record it. He was much more diligent about recording the debate from a variety of perspectives on the Indian indenture bill that was also passed in that legislative session. So we have at least, I would say, half a dozen to maybe 10 people who weigh in on that bill. And it's recorded by George Watt. For the servant code, only 3 speeches are recorded. And frustratingly, we know that Orson Pratt speaks again on February 4th, the day before Brigham Young gives his speech on February 5th. We know he speaks on February 4th because Brigham Young says it. And Brigham Young says, Pratt only got up here to stick his thumb into me again. So we know that the debate is continuing, but frustratingly, Pratt's speech on February 4th is not recorded. Sometimes people say, you know, if you could travel back in time as historians, where would you go to? And I would go to February 4th to the legislative session to hear Orson Pratt's speech on February 4th, because I'd love to know what he says. I think that's what animates Brigham Young's punch back on February 5th, his really strident speech on February 5th. I think he's responding to Orson Pratt. Anyway, so that's sort of some context for what we do know. I think there was a second part to your question, and I completely forgot.
Well, I'm just wondering if this came up in the courts or in the legislature thereafter.
Not in the legislature, as far as we can tell, but it does come up in one court case, and Christopher Rich is handling it, so I'm still kind of fuzzy on the details, but I think it's Daniel Camp, who is, or Dan, who is enslaved to, I think it's William Camp, and his bishop is Bishop Woolley, who is a former Quaker, and so we have a sense of his perspective about slavery, and there's a sense that William Camp is going to try to take Dan out of the territory, and the court comes down on the side of Dan because of the servant code. And so that's one example where we see that legal rights are granted to an enslaved person as a result of the law that is passed. And then, like I mentioned, we have, I think, 3 probate registration of servants. So the law requires the enslaver to take their enslaved to the probate judge and register them. The record indicates that there is a registration book of enslaved, and as far as I can tell, it does not survive. The Utah State Historical Society doesn't have it. The State Archives does not have it. The county does not have it. Records refer to it, but it doesn't survive as far as I can tell. That's my holy grail. I would love to find that. But and the LDS Church History Library also does not have it. Every institution I can think of that would likely have this doesn't claim to have it in their archive. And so we do have 3 cases where the enslaver shows up to a probate judge and it is recorded, and we will include those in our documentary history. They happen to center around moments where there's a probate that's taking place, and so they want to follow the law, it seems, and register their servant as the law requires, so that other legal matters can play out appropriately because they have followed the law. So that's as much as we can ferret out, frustratingly, how this law has an influence and an impact on the lives of those who are enslaved. Just some very sparse evidence that do show up in the legal records. And like I mentioned, the Deseret News does post notice, not big headline, just sort of a sidebar, that Congress in 1862 passes a law freeing the slaves in all U.S. territories. Does that get out? Does it trickle down? Do those who are enslaved know about it? We don't know the answer to that. We just know we did look at the Deseret News to try to find it, and we do find it. And we also find indication that John Bernheisel, who is Utah's territorial delegate to Congress, sends a letter to Brigham Young telling him, hey, by the way, this law passes. And so Brigham Young knows, the Deseret News does publish notice of it. How does that word spread throughout the territory to those who are enslaved, that in fact they are now legally free? Unable to answer that question. I really just don't know. We haven't found evidence to tell us.
Well, it sure sounds like there's a lot that remains to be known, but of course we're limited by, in some ways, the sources that, in most ways, the sources available to us. Mel, do you have further plans with the life of John Burton? Is there more that you feel needs to be fleshed out about his story?
Yeah, I do. One is dealing with the parameters of family history, genealogy, historical fiction. I am in pursuit of the family records of the Robinsons, Burtons, and McCords that Mary West Riggs relied on to write her 5 Branches of Love. It's a romantic fiction, but it's based on what they would call family facts. I think I would go with family lore, but apparently there's a lot of it. I am trying to find those records, and I think I may have hit a vein of good worth to follow this week. Why she is important: she's a granddaughter of Susan. And Susan McCord and John Burton knew each other for 50 years. Her mother knew John for 17 years until he died. The last comments we have of John, as Paul knows, and it's recorded in his Century of Black Mormons, is a letter that we both think was dictated, that we don't think John wrote. We don't think he was literate. That writes to the young woman who has just been married and living in Bountiful. And the sense of the conversation from John's side is very comfortable, almost family-like, having known this young woman all of her life, wishing her well, and that he asked her to ask another family friend to send him some of those preserves. And I don't remember if it was peaches or what, but in the way that he asked, you're pretty sure that his request would be granted. And he says, I am suffering from the chills and shakes. What he's suffering from was the ague, from the fevers and the chills. And he will die 3 weeks later. And that's the last we'll hear of John Burton until Susan McCord's granddaughter writes this romantic fiction on the 5 branches of Bishop Robinson's family, his 5 wives. Once again, this is why I'm going back to the concept. And my first graduate degree was in literature, so I'm always interested in literary art. How do you handle mythology? How do you handle, my family were not slavers. And if they were slavers, they freed them as soon as they joined the church. And if they were slavers, what does that have to do with me today? I have no moral imperative to deal with that. These are all conversations we're going to be holding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I just feel like this is it's an important thing to start having a conversation about, or to continue having a conversation about. And I'm wondering if last question for me, is there any recommendations of how to move this conversation forward among historians, maybe from historians to the public, from the public to historians? I'd love your thoughts on that.
Paul and I have discussed this very briefly, and with your permission, Paul, I'll share some of that. We think that as academicians, as historians, and with our connections at various institutions in the state, that we can begin with our universities and colleges and how to set up some kind of concept of an evening discussion with the panelist of 4 or 5 people. So if we're talking about Dixie State University, then we can talk about color, race, and Dixie down here in the Southwest and our history here. And how do we deal with it? Let me tell you, there's really quite a debate going online in Facebook, elsewhere, and in the newspaper on how to deal with it. And calmly, politely, thoughtfully, and honestly. So I would imagine those sections of a university that deals with humanities and liberal arts would be one place that we could begin. I would like to see the fraternal and sorority organizations, Elks, Masons, Sigma Phi, and the others, begin amongst them too, and broaden it out through their organizations. I would like to see a community dialogue at a culture center in each of the communities. But what it will take is committed individuals that are willing to do that and willing to be kind to each and all signs as we work through this, that Black lives do matter, that Black Mormon lives do matter, that Black slave Mormon lives mattered then and matter now. And what does it tell us about ourselves? John Lewis is right, though. We need to do the conversation with compassion. We can't do it with vengeance. We can't do it with an excess of virtue. Enforced compliance is nothing more than putting a Band-Aid on a weeping sore that will be ripped off again. We had a chance to do this from 1864 to 1872, and we got through the door and got some laws passed, and then it stopped, because that was as far as the body politic and the citizenship was willing to go. We have a unique new opportunity today in all of our communities to say that when we say Black lives matter, we're really saying all lives matter, but we need to look at the Samaritans of our time. And the Samaritans of our time include people of color and race. And we need a commitment that racism is an abhorrent evil, and recognize where we done wrong and where we can do better. And all historians, of course, are thrilled to really discuss the issue of presentism, its virtues and its less than virtues and how it's used. Thanks for asking that. That has been heavy on me ever since all of this started last March. I never thought that after the failure of the French Student Union in 1868 and our student protests in the late 60s, early 70s. I never thought we would see this day come again. And here it is. It comes again because William Faulkner is right. It's the cross of our culture, and we'll carry it until we resolve it.
Thank you, Mel. Well, is that the last word? Okay. That's a great last word. Thank you so much to both of you for joining and presenting your work on race and slavery in early Utah, and for continuing the conversation, for the work that you do. So I appreciate it. I know a lot of others do as well. So thanks again.